if that's all right. Okay. All right, here we go. Rogers TV, the voice of college football, discussing the Urban Meyer scandal at Ohio State that has really unfolded just over the last few days, even though it goes back, some instances, to a week in one level, and then obviously back to 2009 from its very origin. We're joined by Steve Hellwagon from 247 Sports, where he is the senior Big Ten writer and also their on Bucknuts as well. Steve, I appreciate you taking the time, because I'm sure your life has been a whirlwind over the last several days, just trying to keep track of anytime there's a legal case or an NCAA type case, anything involving off the field misconduct. You obviously have to make sure things are right, they're square. You can't just go with anything that you hear, even if it sounds like, hey, this is breaking information. Just in terms of your job and trying to verify everything is very difficult.
Definitely, and this has been a drawn-out process, and certainly, I think, as you mentioned, goes back to 2009 when Coach Meyer was Florida, and Zach Smith was a student assistant for him, wide receivers coach he turned out to be at Ohio State. He is the grandson of former Ohio State head coach Earl Bruce, who gave Urban his beginning as a graduate assistant at Ohio State in the mid-'80s, then hired him at Colorado State as a full-time assistant coach, and was seen as a mentor, even a second father, I guess, for Urban Meyer. So he always thought he should look out for Zach Smith, his grandson, in the profession. In 2009, Zach was a student assistant coach at Florida, helping out Urban Meyer and the Gators there. And an allegation came up that of domestic violence against Zach Smith in an altercation with his wife, Courtney, who was pregnant at the time. Urban was at least knowledgeable that an incident had occurred. I'm not entirely sure if he was fully aware of all of the details, because at that time, he and his wife, Shelley, got involved with trying to counsel the couple to try and help them out. Earl Bruce and Zach's mother came down to Florida, according to this report from Brett McMurphy, and tried to talk with her as well. And she did not end up pressing charges, and he ended up staying with Coach Meyer, went away for a year or two at Marshall and Temple. And then in 2012, when Urban Meyer became the head coach at Ohio State, Zach Smith came with him as the wide receivers coach. Up until a week ago, he was still on the staff at Ohio State and was the only surviving staff member from when Meyer arrived in 2012. Curiously, he was still the lowest paid member of the staff at $340,000, which could go to job performance or off the field issues, or however you want to put it, just relative youth. Everybody who came into Ohio State had more experience than Zach did at that level. But be it whatever it is, you fast forward to 2015, there was another incident allegedly that happened. And again, Zach Smith, no charges filed, though he and his wife did get a divorce. You come up to 2018, another incident occurs. Zach ultimately loses his job at Ohio State as a result of all the publicity that surrounds the reporting of all this. Brett McMurphy gets involved, former ESPN reporter, writing basically stories on his Facebook page. It was painfully obvious that somebody with an axe to grind with Ohio State, with Zach Smith, with Urban Meyer, whoever that may be, put all of this information in Brett McMurphy's hands, and he ran with it. He nailed down all the details with police reports, corroboration, talking to the attorney, talking to Courtney Smith, everybody that he could get on the record to talk about it, and certainly documented that there was an incident in 2015. Urban Meyer, speaking at the Big Ten meetings last week, tried to disavow any knowledge of a 2015 incident involving Zach Smith, even waved Brett McMurphy away and said the ship had sailed with questions on the Zach Smith issue, and Meyer wasn't going to talk more about it. Well, obviously things blew up on Wednesday morning. Brett McMurphy put out a story that had text messages from Courtney Smith to Shelley Meyer, Urban Meyer's wife, discussing the 2015 incident. Shelley Meyer saying that she would probably have to tell Urban Meyer about it, and so on. And I guess the crux of the issue now, Urban Meyer has been placed on paid administrative leave, trying to ascertain, has he been caught in a lie? Did he know about the 2015 incident and just concoct that statement last week so that he wouldn't have to talk about it or justify his employment of Zach Smith since 2015, which would have been a tough question in and of itself if it's proven he knew about that. So Gene Smith, the athletic director, Michael Drake, the university president, presumably involved in this, and Urban Meyer now on a paid administrative leave. And that's where things have been left at this point. So, yeah, I think Ohio State is supposed to kick off preseason camp on Friday. They were supposed to have a media availability. That's been canceled, and we have been told that to stay tuned to Monday, and perhaps at that time we'll have a better idea if there'll be any kind of media availability. And this whole situation with Myers in a holding pattern right now.
Mark Rogers, the voice of college football, on the line with Steve Hellwagon from 247 Sports. You can join him on bucknuts.com on the Urban Meyer situation. And so one thing comes to mind. I've heard and read a number of places that this most recent incident involving Zach Smith and his ex-wife, the protection order violation actually had to do with Zach Smith either picking up his kids or dropping off his kids at the wrong time. Is that correct? Has that been verified? Do you know, Steve?
Well, I think that there's some confusion about all of this. In December of 2017, Zach Smith appeared at Courtney Smith's residence and was counseled by police at that time not to come back, that she did not want him there. I think there's some confusion whether there was a restraining order, a protective order, however you want to term it. I'm not a legal expert in that regard to know. I believe he was supposed to stay 500 feet from her residence, I think was what the term was. What happened in May was there was a visitation. He had his son. He contacted Courtney, and they were to meet presumably near her residence, as I understand, if she lives in an apartment complex. And again, if I don't have everything perfect on this, please understand I'm doing the best I can to sift through this. Let's say they were supposed to meet in the parking lot near the swimming pool of the apartment complex. She did not appear at that agreed upon location at the time they agreed to meet. He texted her and said, I am bringing him to you now at your place. She said, do not come here. He went there anyway, pulled into the driveway as we understand it, and was photographed by Courtney Smith on her quote-unquote property, which even as a rental is considered, I suppose, her property. Again, not a legal expert, just playing one on the internet here. But at that point, with that photo documentation, she went to the police and had him cited for trespassing. That in and of itself didn't make any news. And in fact, nobody knew about that for 2 full months until right before the Chicago trip last week, that the news of that came out, and that he was facing a trespassing charge and had entered a not guilty plea, and that was going through the court system in Delaware County, just north of Columbus. But subsequent to that, Brett McMurphy got full details of the 2009 incident, including allegedly Zach Smith bringing another woman into their residence, them having an argument about that, Courtney Smith driving the other woman home and then coming home only to allegedly become a victim of an assault upon her return home. So I think the details of that, when they were made public, was ultimately the last straw for Zach Smith. Urban Meyer knew that there had been an incident in 2009. He did not know to what degree it sounds like that incident was. And when those details came out that he had potentially shoved his pregnant wife against the wall, that was the end of the line, I think, for Zach Smith and Ohio State.
So the text messages between Courtney Smith and Shelley Meyer would seem to be a smoking gun of sorts. Now, what would be the damning evidence is if there's verification, confirmation that Shelley Meyer said that she told Urban Meyer We haven't come across that. Actually, there was some indication somewhere that Courtney Smith said that Shelley Meyer gave indication that she didn't tell her husband.
Yeah, I don't know if we know one way or the other, Elway and a couple of others who were at their college football remote, that they were planning their coverage, and they each offered their 2 cents on this. Trevor Maddich made a very good point that Urban Meyer, as an Ohio State employee, would have had a university-issued cell phone, email address, probably computer, etc., a tablet, whatever it may have, using a forensic menu, and when he knew it. And I think if they can get to the bottom of this and prove that he did have full knowledge of a 2015 incident, and then went to Chicago and disavowed any knowledge of it, and said something that wasn't truthful in front of the media, and really the only reason he would have done that would have been to avoid the question of why did you keep him on your staff after the 2015 incident for another 3 full years until he was finally let go. And then only because the media made some outrageous report, and outrageous isn't even the right word, scandalous report of what happened in 2009, basically, that forced their hand. He had to go. Smith had to go at that point when that report made the public wave. So the timeline of this thing is so interwoven, and it's just hard to keep it all fresh in your mind. But the crux of this entire issue and where they're at today were Urban Meyer's comments and really his conduct and his attitude in addressing the situation last Tuesday, first in his morning 15-minute session at the podium, and then in the hour-long breakout room session. He did answer several questions about the situation, why he had to fire Zach Smith, as he said at that time, was for the good of the program. And secondly, what he knew about 2009, which in his admission wasn't very much until the McMurphy first report came out with the details of the 2009 incident that ultimately had to lead to Zach Smith's dismissal. And adamant that he was not aware of a 2015 incident, and even made a comment, "I don't know who makes those stories up," seemingly in reference to Brett McMurphy, who conveniently was in Chicago and started asking Urban Meyer questions. He got the swat away hand gesture, and the ship has sailed on those questions during the breakout session. And he also made several remarks that caught me a little bit off guard, talking about how domestic violence is a he said, she said situation, a couple of other things that just didn't, I think, rub people the wrong way with the attitude and the appearance that he had in handling this situation. These are football meetings. These are preseason football media days. Most of the focus typically is on football. But in this instance, real life kind of superseded that, and he didn't do a really good job of handling that, up until the point that we are now wondering, did he make a untruthful statement about what he knew about 2015? And if he did, I think people are going to be very critical if he's allowed to continue as the Ohio State head coach. Personally, I think he has a chance to come back from this, but he has got to show some real contrition in this situation, and he has got to really come clean, in my opinion. He, the athletic director, Gene Smith, and even the university president, Michael Drake.
And enabling them to a certain extent, or that being the perception. And then also, since he's been at Ohio State, I think in light of that perception in Florida, he's been extremely hard and rigid on his athletes, and has gone the extra measure even when before they've been proven guilty of anything. There's a number of occasions in which he has levied harsh penalties beforehand to show that, hey, we don't put up with domestic violence type issues. And then also, just obviously in this environment, you give the female the benefit of the doubt, and you start there to say, let's take this as serious as possible, and then we'll work back from there to see what certainly happened. And he didn't do that.
No, Mark, I think you make a very good point. I think his record at Florida, the record of the players who were involved in off-the-field issues at Florida, is well documented. Kobe and JT Barrett had a DUI in the middle of the 2015 season. Otherwise, the off-the-field issues from the players have been very much few and far between. And moreover, the climate around the football program seems to be night and day different than what they had at Florida. He is graduating his players. 11 of the 22 players who started in the Cotton Bowl were graduates of Ohio State, which is just an amazing number in my mind. A lot of fifth-year guys, certainly, but even Joe Burrow, who just transferred from Ohio State, was there 3 years and got his degree. So I think there are a lot of positives in the football meeting room, talking to the players from the football team and the basketball team. With her set the expectation, kind of her symposium that she gives, basically counseling players don't fall into this trap of how not to treat people, how not to treat women, how not to treat your wife, your girlfriend, etc. And so there have been a lot of positives up and down the line, things that have accomplished outside of football. The football alone has been amazing, averaged over 12 wins a year, a national championship, 2 Big Ten championships. And now, certainly, as we mentioned, everything else that's been well documented that they've done off the field. But this Zach Smith thing is a complete anomaly. And for some reason, Urban Meyer got ensconced in this, and it is a tangle that could ultimately take him down as the head coach at Ohio State.
Steve Hellwagon on the line from 247 Sports. We've got him for about 10 more minutes in discussing the Urban Meyer situation at Ohio State. So that's everything involving the incidents and the handling of it by Urban Meyer, potentially. Let's move on to the administrative leave. What you think that speaks to the situation? Some say that's a way to just see the process vet itself out, and for Urban Meyer to regroup and fight this. Others think that they're just working out details to cut and run, and that's the end of it for Meyer at Ohio State. Your thoughts about that, and how long this could possibly go on, this administrative leave?
I think that it was a good thing that Urban Meyer was quoted in the release that Ohio State had, and even said, I look forward to this being resolved quickly. I think that paid leave is somewhat of a positive, I suppose. I think about the Louisville situation. with Rick Pitino, the athletic director, Tom Jurich. They were put on end of next week. They're able to ascertain that he should remain as the head coach at Ohio State. Then that's what it is. And at that time, I would figure that they would come forward and explain their position and why this was the finding that they had. Mark, out of Chicago, I think public sentiment nationally was running 100-1 against Urban Meyer. You had Stuart Mandel of The Athletic wrote a very scathing article. I was in Chicago, picked up the Tribune. Shannon Ryan, who's covered Illinois forever, wrote a scathing column about it. Nancy Armour in USA Today, almost word for word, wrote the same thing. Now, generally, those last two are obviously females, and they have perhaps a different worldview of the whole situation than even a male reporter would have. But everybody was unanimous in their thought that he kind of poo-pooed the whole situation, didn't treat it with a lot of seriousness, didn't have the proper attitude, body language, response to the whole situation. And now you're left to wonder, after the McMurphy report on Wednesday morning, was he just trying to pull the wool over everybody's eyes out there and save himself from having to defend why he kept this guy who at best is a bad actor, at worst is a serial wife beater, why they kept him around? And I think that maybe it was self-preservation, or maybe he just didn't want to drag them through the mud any more than they had already been. I mean, this is a private situation between two people with two small children. And again, you think about that, you feel so bad. Obviously, if the allegation is true, you feel bad for her as the victim, feel as bad or worse for those small children who are caught in the middle of this terrible situation. You hope, if this is all true, that Zach Smith gets the help he needs and they're able to go on and all lead productive lives. But their lives have been essentially torn apart in front of the public, and it's just a totally untenable situation. And I think Meyer, again, caught in the middle in this, and knowing these people personally for so long, having the personal connection as well as the professional connection, He was just put in a very difficult position here by Zach Smith and didn't handle it perhaps the way he could have or should have.
So to compare the transactions is a drop in the ocean compared to Jim Tressel, obviously just covering up for an exchange of tattoos and merchandise and memorabilia and awards. But I'll make the correlation in terms of covering up and just thinking that it's just going to go away. And Urban Meyer, I have to think he is just so much smarter than thinking that in this day and age of technology and paper trails everywhere, that if a reporter of Brett McMurphy's caliber and status, at least at one point, is making those type of accusations, that self-preservation is only going to last for a day or two or a week or a month or whatever it is, but it's temporary.
Yeah, I think the lesson here is if there is something that that you need to address, you need to get out in front of it. And it didn't need to rise to this level. And I think it had pretty much blown over until Wednesday when, again, another huge bombshell from Brett McMurphy. So I guess in the long and short of it, we will see what the university discovers during the course of their investigation. If they determine that Urban Meyer didn't act appropriately, then I'm certain they'll take the necessary steps. Couldn't recruit anymore. Well, Urban Meyer has 5 years left on one of the most lucrative contracts in college football history, paying him roughly $7 million a year, somewhere between $35 and $40 million over the next 5 years. If they are going to dissociate themselves, terminate, separate from Urban Meyer, they probably need to figure out a way to do it for a cause, because otherwise they're going to owe him $20, $30 million, whatever the buyout of that contract might be. So, he's got the best attorneys in America. I know at one point Trace Armstrong, the former Chicago Bears player, was his representative. He's got, great representation. So they wrote an ironclad contract, and Ohio State wanted it that way. They didn't want him to go anywhere up until the last week or two. And now he is essentially on trial for his coaching life at this point. And I guess we'll see what direction this turns. I think there is a chance, a door open for him to return to Ohio State. But again, as I said, it's going to take him hat in hand, answering every question truthfully and honestly, and even throwing in the mea culpa that, man, I should have done this at this point. I should have done that at that point. It started out with the best that only a few people knew about. Did you know about it?
Mark Rogers TV discussing the Urban Meyer scandal with Steve Hellwagon, senior Big Ten writer for 247 Sports and Bucknuts. Steve, we've got you for a couple more minutes before we let you go. Somebody's got to coach these kids. It's still a very talented football team, obviously, and somebody's got to coach them. Fortunately, on one hand, it's a very experienced coaching staff. What struck me odd, and I was trying to interpret this, Ryan Day is given the interim tag or the acting tag as head coach. Greg Schiano coached in the NFL. He coached in the Big Ten at Rutgers, or a school that's currently in the Big Ten at Rutgers. Kevin Wilson at Indiana. But Wilson and Schiano have their issues, or have had their issues off field. Do you believe that's why Ryan Day was given the temporary keys?
Definitely. I think Schiano, all things considered, would be the head coach at Tennessee right now had there not been a major social media backlash last December. They had beaten Michigan, were preparing to play Wisconsin on Sunday afternoon. They went out on the practice field. He negotiated the deal with Tennessee, and in the 3 hours they were on the practice field, Clay Travis and many other people led a social media outcry against Greg Schiano. They used the Penn State tie from 20 years prior. Did he or did he not know anything about what Jerry Sandusky was doing at Penn State? But let's not kid ourselves or mistake for one moment. They didn't want him as the head coach. The fans didn't want him as the head coach at Tennessee because he had failed as the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the NFL. That's the long and short of it. They used Penn State as their crutch to dissociate themselves from Greg Schiano. I think in this instance, Ohio State, with the controversy, the turmoil that they were in, they could not afford to put themselves in a position of putting Greg Schiano in charge of the program at this point, for the simple fact of that would have just opened up so many more questions from the Dodds, the Forties, the Stewie Mandels, all these people. You've gone from the frying pan to the fire here. You need to be cleaner than the emperor's wife, type thing. And for just making light of this situation. But it's unfortunate because Greg Schiano is a great guy, great football coach, and I fully expect he'll be a head coach somewhere sooner rather than later. That wasn't the spot at that point in time for him to jump off. Ryan Day, you mentioned Kevin Wilson had his own issues leaving Indiana, not sure what the disposition of that was, but he basically walked away from that job and left money on the table to walk away. So draw your own conclusion, but they didn't want him at Indiana anymore, and he'd been their most successful head coach that they'd had in a very long time. So unfortunate for those two situations. But Ryan Day, an up-and-comer, 39 years old, worked with Chip Kelly with the Eagles, the 49ers. He had gotten his foot in the door at Florida because he and Dan Mullen, very much a coincidence, are from the same small hometown in New Hampshire. I believe Ryan Day played at New Hampshire, was a grad assistant in a few different places, served as an assistant coach at Boston College, latched on with Chip Kelly for his very abbreviated NFL runs, and was out there for the taking a year ago, and Urban Meyer scooped him right up. Urban and Chip Kelly are good friends, good acquaintances, and I'm certain that he came recommended by Kelly for Urban Meyer to hire him, and he did a wonder with the Ohio State offense last year, he and Kevin Wilson working in concert with one another. So Day is getting the opportunity as the acting head coach. My guess is all the practice plans were probably written weeks ago for this first couple of weeks, which are pretty much by the numbers, fundamentals, rotate everybody in there, get a look at everybody, try every different play, every different scheme, throw it all against the wall and see what sticks. And then after 2 weeks or so, these colleges will whittle down the units, whittle down the playbook and the scheme and everything else. So, he'll be able to concentrate still coaching the quarterbacks. He'll just be the one blowing the whistle and getting the guys together at the beginning to send them off to start their day of work, and then pulling them together at the end to let them know this was a productive day. No, this wasn't a productive day. I need you to do better for me tomorrow type thing. And then it'll just be the normal coaching duties from there. But right now, completely up in the air, premature to say he's going to ever coach a regular season game. Interesting to note, Schiano's contract is $1.5 million, and Ryan Day's contract is $1 million. We have no indication that there's been an amendment, a per diem or anything like that has been added for him as his acting head coach duties, which you would think they would address that at some point if it comes to that. Just a temporary situation, it seems, for now. But he also has, over a 3-year period, Mark, he has over $800,000 in incentives, retention incentives to stay. So if he's there a year from now, he gets an extra $300,000 as a bonus for not jumping off to be an assistant or a head coach someplace else. So it very much looks and feels like he is their head coach in waiting. And if they're satisfied that it's his time to take this over and that Urban Meyer's day is done, then it very well could be his job. What we saw with Luke Fickell is he got the job for 2011. It was not a particularly good year, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that half of the team's best players didn't get to play the first half of the season because of the tattoo gate, whole situation. Guys like DeVere Posey and Boom Heron and Terrell Pryor didn't even come back. But so that season was kind of doomed from the start. But in this instance, Mark, as we saw today, the USA cut-ups every day to see who's doing what. Because how do you drop somebody back in there in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months, whenever it may be, and say, okay, you're the head coach again, but he hasn't been with the team through practice, game planning, schemes, anything else? Seems kind of a tough situation, I think, to expect that. So the longer that goes on, the longer he will not be familiar at all with whatever it is Ohio State's trying to do in 2018, and yet he'd be the head coach. That seems kind of a weird situation.
Somewhat unprecedented. It's quite the drama off the field in Columbus, unfortunately. involving, as Steve has outlined, a number of innocent people and victims. And it's created a football drama and possibly the end of one of the 5 greatest coaching records. And
he's the winningest active coach, highest winning percentage, 851 among all FBS coaches. And in fact, in major college football history, I think it's Newt Rockne, Frank Leahy at Notre Dame, and then Urban Meyer, all-time winning percentage, 851. That is strictly, I think, at what we consider today the FBS Division 1A ranks. There are probably people who have coached at Division 3 or Division 2 or at some other level that maybe have a higher winning percentage, but against the best of the best, with the best of the best, he is number 3 all-time in win percentage, which is 3 national championships. Pretty amazing stuff.
Exactly. You have to go back to the leather helmets and the black and white pictures, and one school, Notre Dame, and when they were dominating college football in the 1920s and 30s, to best the record of Urban Meyer and his consistency in winning. And that 85% overall at Bowling Green, Utah, Florida, and Ohio State, more closer to 90%, considering 73-8 at Ohio State, which it really boggles my mind when you think about 91% winning percentage. If you go 7-5 one year, you've got to win like 40 consecutive games to make up for that. That is consistent winning that's almost unmatched in college football history.
Yeah, it's really a crazy record. I think he's lost 7 games in 6 years at Ohio State, and one of them was obviously to Virginia Tech. You go down through the line. I think he's lost to Michigan State twice, lost to Penn State once, Iowa knocking off the Buckeyes. He was a made man on game number 2, and Baker Mayfield planting the flag as well. So a lot of Ohio Buckeye fans, Cleveland fans are having to kind of overlook that now that Baker Mayfield is the flavor of the month with the Cleveland Browns. But I think getting back to Meyer, his dominance to the Big Ten, it's an apples and oranges comparison. He has 2 Big Ten championships in 6 years. They were only eligible to win it in 5 of those years. Went to the championship game one other time and lost to Michigan State. The difference is Woody Hayes, Earl Bruce, John Cooper, Jim Tressel, none of them had to win an extra game, the Big Ten championship, to get that championship. In fact, Tressel in 2010 got the benefit, although that season was wiped out by sanctions. They were tri-champions that year with Wisconsin and Michigan State all tied at the top. So in some years, 3 teams could win the Big Ten. Right now, it's 1 team, and you got to make your way through a 9-game conference season, which that's been rare, very rare in Big Ten annals. They did it for a few years in the 1980s and then scrapped it back. And they're even talking about going back to 8 since they did make the playoff last year. When it talks to the Big Ten Network, a better inventory of games for them, particularly in the month of September. You think about September is going to kick off with Purdue against Northwestern on a Thursday night. You want to talk about a great game to kick off your season. 2 teams that are hungry, could contend in the West. We're both right there last year. That's why we have 9 Big Ten games, is because you want that quality product all season long. The SEC, the ACC only play 8 conference games. Those teams typically will play 1 Power 5 team outside the conference. And here Ohio State this year is playing 9 Big Ten games, plus TCU down in Texas, plus Oregon State, which granted
at Steve Hellwagon, with everything that he's got going on, trying to track down, as we've touched upon, and there's probably about 37 different angles that we didn't, but basically from the incidents that occurred, the interpretation of the administrative leave, the football ramifications, and everything that involves. So much to talk about, so much to cover. So Steve doing a great job, and we appreciate the insight, the information, and the perspective that you have, unlike just about anybody else, Steve. We appreciate it.
All right, Mark, thank you again. And hopefully we'll have better things to talk about next week.
We'll talk some football.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right, Steve. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, striking up the live stream with Steve Hellwagon from 247 Sports. We appreciate his time, and enjoy everyone joining the chat with your comments, questions, and so forth. And so if you missed any of the conversation with Steve, certainly it will press and post in just a couple minutes. So if you're jumping in late, Steve got us going off the top with knocking out and drawing the timeline and then taking it from there. So go back. The video will post to my channel in just a few minutes and will be available for you. And of course, we are going to start breaking down team camp reports here at Mark Rogers TV very soon. We're ranking all the schedules, 70 all the way up to number 1 in college football. And also, once we get done with our series on schedule rankings, we're going to preview all the teams in the Power 5, plus predict the final standings. And I'll have to take this into consideration as well in making a projection toward the college football playoff and the national championship. So we will see everyone next time. Thanks for supporting Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football.